You're listening to the Headless WP podcast, where we discuss all things headless WordPress. The Headless WP podcast is a production of the WP Engine Developer Relations team. If you're interested in more content on headless WordPress, check out developers.wpengine.com for blog posts, tutorials, videos, and more. All right, I'm Jeff Everhart. Welcome to the Headless WP podcast. I'm joined today by my co-host, Fran and Jeff, and our guest today is Sam Bhagwat. Sam is the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Gatsby, and he recently published a book called Modular, the web's new architecture and how it's changing online business. And he's here today to discuss some of those ideas with us, and hopefully we get on some really cool side tangents about where the modular web is headed. So Fran, Sam, how's it going?
Going great. Thanks for having us. I'm super excited to be here.
Likewise, awesome. Jeff, I'm pretty stoked to have Sam on the podcast. Gatsby's definitely been a front-end framework and a static site generator at the kind of genesis of this whole decoupled modular web movement, for sure. And this is great to have Sam on the show.
For sure. And I'm excited, like omission here, like Gatsby as a framework is probably the one I'm like least familiar with. So I'm really excited to kind of like learn a little bit more from you. But Sam, this is a question we like to ask all of our guests. So before we get started, could you just give us a little background on yourself and like what's your web development journey look like and how did that bring you to Gatsby?
Yeah, so I've been a developer for I guess like 8-9 years now. Got into it because I was a business analyst and kind of looking for a career change. Started off more on the back end, but kind of worked my way into the front end. And then around like 2016, 2017, my close friend Kyle Matthews it started Gatsby as an open source project. He'd gotten really excited about React. And started Gatsby as an open source project to build websites with React. And as Gatsby kind of started taking off, really, like Kyle and I just kind of looked at each other and like, I guess, are we going to make this into a company? And I guess we're going to do this now. And so that was kind of the journey into founding Gatsby as a company. And now we've been a company for about like 5 years now.
Awesome.
That's awesome. And it's interesting because I know, like Jeff mentioned at the start of the intro, that you did write a book, which I'm super stoked to go over. But before we do that, could you educate our listeners and actually myself too on Gatsby in general as a framework and actually Gatsby Cloud now that it's in the marketplace, Sam?
Yeah. So Gatsby was actually the first React-based static site generator. Gatsby kind of started because Kyle wanted to build a website for his company, and it was like, I wanted to build it with React, and it was like, well, there's not a tool letting me do that. Let me build my own tool. Let me open source that tool and let me use that tool. And, it was way back in 2015, and so a lot of things have happened since then. Back in 2017, we released Gatsby v1, which had a data layer and integrations with WordPress, with Contentful, with Sanity, with Datto, with Drupal, with a number of headless CMSs and traditional CMSs that can be used in a headless mode. And then like over time, as again, we were the first framework, but like there was obviously an explosion of frameworks, and so like as there became an explosion of frameworks, what we really focused on being a great framework for the content web and for like really complex content sites. And that started off with our data layer and the integrations we have with CMSs. So if you use Gatsby, your data kind of already comes with you from your CMS, whether that's WordPress, whether it's Contentful. Maybe you're using multiple CMSs or data sources and kind of bring it together. You don't have to sort of fetch it. It sort of already comes into the Gatsby's Graphql data layer, and you can just write kind of queries in Graphql and sort of get see what data to put that you need, and then just paste your queries inside your pages and components. So we built Gatsby Cloud kind of as a way. What we realized is that Kyle has a background in the Drupal world, so in like the content web, and we knew that like, back in 2017, 2018, like people were just building like fairly small sites. But we knew that they were going to be people were going to be building 1,000 pages, 100,000 pages, larger sites. And so we really started focusing on how do we minimize build times and have content kind of go live immediately. And so that's been a journey of a few years. We've built Gatsby Cloud to sort of do that, because a lot of times you need to have a really tightly coupled build and deploy hosting platform that's really tied to that framework, so that like the two just know about each other really well, and the whole flow can be optimized. And so recently we published a post. Cal published a post on reactive site generation, which is our term for sort of what's like the RSG. SSG is the old thing, RSG is the new thing, and what we mean by RSG is that you're just like React, your framework is reactive to changes, and you can get changes live from your CMS onto the page or into your preview environment in 5 seconds, which is what you need from a content perspective.
That was a really impressive demo. I saw that on Twitter and I was like, oh wow, that's crazy fast. Yeah, wow. And so there are two things I kind of want to like tease out there that you mentioned. First is like, this is just education I'm saying I need to go do, like on the data layer of Gatsby. Like all that sounds super interesting to me. And I think like before we started recording, we were on this awesome side tangent talking about like the idea of GraphQL data layers and all these companies like trying to do stuff like that. So I'm really intrigued by that and to like see where that goes. But the other term that I just heard you say that I really like is the idea of the content web. And I've never heard anybody say it that way, but I like that term for what it sort of encompasses. And we've had one of our recent guests that we recorded a podcast. It hasn't been released yet, but with like the Astro folks. Yeah. And again, they had this focus on like this idea of content focused sites. So it's really cool to hear that was like your all's initial focus. And I like that because like, and I don't know, maybe you could educate me here too. Like, has Gatsby added stuff to like support web application use cases? Like, I don't know, like how do you all make decisions around that? And in terms of framework development?
Yeah, that's a question we ask ourselves every day. Yeah. So I'm glad you're asking it here on the podcast. But I'd say that like, so starting with the first thing you asked, we talk about this a lot, like the content web. Back in 2018, I wrote a series of blog posts and coined this term called the content mesh, which is the idea of just a bunch of different sort of data sources coming together into an application or into a website rather. And the content web is we as developers are like really excited about building the code side of things, but websites are one of the most cross-functional projects in any organization, and you have content teams, and you have demand gen teams, and you have designers, and product and project marketing managers, and the marketing execs who are very concerned about like conversion and lead generation and revenue, and like it's great that websites are so cross-functional, and one of the things and so some web projects are more sort of like dev focused, and others like others are like there's maybe 2 devs or 3 devs, and there's maybe 10 content editors or 20 content editors. Yep. Especially in places like, let's say a university or someone that's doing a lot of scientific publishing. Absolutely. Like these kinds of use cases, you have so many content folks that are part of projects relative to the amount of devs. And so it's, as a developer, you're thinking a lot about how do I enable the content teams to have great workflows where they are enabled and set up to do their job well, where they can sort of, hey, I'm making changes and I can see the output of the changes right away. And my systems are integrated well together, where maybe like if my e-commerce data needs to be integrated with my CMS, it's just integrated in a way that's like intuitive, for example. And so, I think like personally, I spend a lot of time drawing architecture diagrams for folks, whether that's like our customers, whether that's in like talks and podcasts of like, hey, kind of like and there's actually some of them in here. Here's how you think about putting all these different systems together in a way that's going to like work really well with your team, for your team.
Man, cool. That's cool. Yeah, the thing is cool. Yeah, and it's funny, Sam, because there's a thing going on in not only the Twitterverse, but just web dev in general. And I'm talking about the developers that actually voice their opinions and make videos about, hey, use this, not that, or they're super heavily opinionated. And Jeff and I ran into a video like 2 or 3 days ago. Is it forget the name of the CMS, but there was just a developer on the video saying literally like fully being like, like if for you Star Wars nerds out there, the Sith think in absolutes, and in web development you should not. It depends, right? You should think like a Jedi.
Exactly.
There are no absolutes. And this guy said, do not use headless WordPress. It's 2022 and it's invalid as a headless CMS. And to your point, I just wanted to ad hoc on is that the marketer and the content editor, whether you like it or not, in an enterprise level, or
they're part of that team.
They're part of the team. And you need to account for their experience as well as a developer experience. Because if those two don't mesh, you're not going to have a website that brings in revenue at the end of the day. That's my opinion, but yeah.
I completely agree. And, we talked to a lot of folks who have they've had a blog on WordPress for 5 years or 10 years. Now they're thinking about how to integrate it into sort of maybe a broader architecture, bringing that content to other systems and pieces of the puzzle. They're talking about like headless WordPress. Headless WordPress is great. And you've got all the content already here. Let's go to headless. Let's use WP GraphQL. Let's keep the benefits of that, the blog if you want it, but also to be able to pull the content into other things. Like let's do it, and like not having to rebuild the whole site. That's great. There's like, we can't as a I think we talk a lot about like the adoption life cycle, and for a greenfield project, do whatever you want for a greenfield project that makes sense for your team. Like a lot of teams have a lot of different stakeholders, and the thing that makes sense for a greenfield project doesn't always make sense for maybe a more mature company, and that's totally okay. We're technologists, and as technologists we should make solutions that work for the people who want to use them.
Amen to that.
Kudos.
Preach it, Sam. Preach it,
for
brother.
Sure. Yeah. All right, so let's get into our next question. So like there's a lot of terms I think that get thrown around when we talk about a certain style of web development, right? We've got JAMstack is one way of talking about it. We've got the idea of like decoupled or headless sites. And then, you sort of talk about the idea of modular site architecture in your book. And so like, how do you conceptualize that? And how is that different from like a traditional CMS website?
Yeah, so I'd say traditional CMS, you have you kind of the monolithic is one way of putting it, but all the different parts of the application are kind of like tightly glued together. So the dev framework side and the content management side, and then a lot of these auxiliary tools like your analytics or your sort of your auth and your search, or you kind of have to. And it's like sometimes like in WordPress, you might have like a whole plugin ecosystem of options. And, if you're using maybe Drupal, you may have some options, but maybe it's fewer. And if you use like an enterprise CMS, like Sitecore or Adobe Experience Manager, you kind of have to just go with whatever's out of the box for those different solutions. And I think like what I should say is that the monolithic CMS approach was a great approach for and it sort of took over the web in the 2010s because it simplified it had pieces that were kind of good enough to build websites that worked really well and like all the pieces existed and worked together. But then sort of like now in the 2020s, we're like, okay, but like, yeah, that works, but can we make it really much better? And so because we're trying to optimize on like, hey, well, what if we had like the best search? Well, like maybe let's use Algolia. What if we want like the best development experience? Okay, like something JavaScript based, React based. Let's go with Gatsby. What if we wanted the best kind of build and deploy or like hosting platform? Where we can go JAMstack, just have files living on the edge on a CDN instead of running servers. Okay, like let's do that. And so, we the CMS is like the monolithic CMS was a pretty good solution. And the mod, to me, it's not like it's like we're going from pretty good to, from good to like even better when we're moving to modular.
That's a good point. I really like the idea that you mentioned there where like you can use the tool or service that's best for that job. Like I'm not tied into maybe say WordPress search. I can pull in Algolia. And like, I guess you could probably do some of that with traditional WordPress, but it's just more cumbersome that way and probably like less maintainable. Because I think about that with like email, like, what are the send grid or being able to just slap on some of those things and like, oh, cool, I've got really reliable email right now. So that's definitely interesting. So like, let me tease that out just a little bit, because I asked you about the difference between like maybe like modular and then traditional or monolithic CMS. Do you feel like there's any difference in terminology between any of the words on the other side that I said, like JAMstack and modular? Is there like difference between decoupled and modular or headless and modular? Are they all sort of, or is there some like level of overlap there?
There are a lot of different words that mean sort of similar things.
Okay.
What I'd say is that, like, if we want to get kind of like technical, and like, I'd say that like modular kind of describes what the architecture is. Sometimes people use the word composable, which describes kind of what you can do with it. And then JAMstack like started as a way to describe the particular architecture of the build and deploy and hosting and framework part of the pieces of the puzzle. And then, people are kind of using it to describe the whole picture too, with like JAMstack CMS or whatever. And it's like, and so I have this diagram here in the book, and which is
cool.
You can kind of see the general shape, which is like a solar system, and you've kind of got these different planets and sort of like moons around the planet. And so you've got sort of your build and deploy hosting with your kind of like React components and your JAMstack framework, your Gatsby right around there. But Gatsby Cloud let's say you use Gatsby Cloud as your build and deploy hosting platform. You've got your headless CMS, so let's say you use WordPress there, and you've got some internationalization workflows that sort of like live around there, and your content approval workflows. Maybe you have some WordPress modules that handle like content kind of approval between multi-user folks, and then you've got these kind of like free floating things. Maybe it's like Algolia, or to do like search or some of these other things. And then hey, you may have like e-commerce, and hey, if you're using this WordPress, you're probably going to use WooCommerce, but if obviously if you use a different CMS, you may make a different e-commerce choice as well. And each of these are kind of like their own planets, and then they have their own ecosystems around them. And so that's kind of conceptually, I think, how I like to frame the space, especially to like a tech lead who's like, this is all really exciting, but I need to explain how this all works kind of together, so I can help bring my company into the future.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting, Sam, because that's kind of a good segue into kind of a thought, and the question that I had for you is like, whether big or small, as far as like the owner of a site, whether it's in a revenue-driven organization or just a blog post that generates information for the public, anything of that nature, whatever the site's purpose is, why would you say like main 2 or 3 things that site owners would move to a modular approach versus staying on traditional?
So like 2 reasons why they would want to do the transition?
Yeah, 2 or 3, or even more if you have any.
Yeah. So that's a great question. I guess there's 2 ways I'm gonna, maybe this is a little bit of a convoluted answer, but I'm going to answer your question in sort of like 2 ways.
Sure.
So one way is, there's a lot of different classes of benefits to moving to modular websites. Modular websites, JAMstack frameworks have better performance a lot of the time because files living on the edge load faster. So there's it's a lot easier to use modern design in the JavaScript community. Decoupled structured content has its own benefits for organizational reusability. A lot of these, standalone services like Algolia or Auth0 that like have their own kind of benefits in terms of just using that kind of tool. The modern analytics worlds, if you look at like the heaps and the segments and like those kinds of tools, they have a lot of benefit in being able to do better marketing analytics with cohorts and segmentation and these types of things. So I'd say that there are these sort of like classes of benefits that are like really dependent on kind of role in the company. Like a demand gen person is going to think about some of them, and like an enterprise architect is going to think about some of them, and like a content, a developer is going to be thinking about some of them, and like a content editor or creator is going to be thinking about some of them. So that's one answer. The second answer to that question would be thinking about something like, okay, from a company perspective, why would you go on this journey and I actually talk about this in the book, and we sort of see three different sort of like stories, if that makes sense, of why a company decides to go on the journey. Like one is kind of, we call this like the butterfly story, which is, the caterpillar kind of turns into a butterfly. It's this process of metamorphosis. And someone has, this, larger organization maybe has a CMS like WordPress or Drupal that they've been using forever, and they've got all their content in it, but they're kind of realizing over time it's maybe just using it monolithically doesn't give them the agility benefits they really want. And so they're trying to make this like slow process of migration and, building new sites in their new framework. And they see this as an organizational transformation process happening over the course of years. And so this is a conversation we often have with customers, and they'll build their first site or their second site or their third site. But, we know just from our conversations, this is like, they have 70 more sites that, but it might take them 5 years, and that's great. Like, we'll be around in 5 years. They'll be around in 5 years. We're here for them. We're with them together on the journey. Right. The second kind of company, we call them like an eagle. And so we see them like sort of, these are usually often like e-commerce or very sort of like conversion-driven sites, and we see them kind of scanning the landscape for like opportunities, basically to improve their conversion. And so usually they do a lot of paid acquisition of customers, whether that's through AdWords or other sort of like tools, and they track conversion kind of like really, really closely. And so they see, we've seen like e-commerce companies that transition onto Gatsby doubling their conversion rates, which is just shocking.
Whoa.
And there's a combination of things. So, it's like the performance of Gatsby, and then like, they may do a redesign as well. And maybe some of that came with like new copy or whatever, but like, when you put those things together and someone can double their conversion rate for like maybe a process that took, 2 months or 3 months of, over like, millions of dollars of revenue, it's just shocking. And it's great. And so we see a lot of folks adopting this modular architecture to get these types of benefits. And then the third another kind of company transformation we see is just a company really wanting to do like a relaunch, and like they've had a lot change and they want to share who they are, and so they're sort of like relaunching their website. They're kind of getting rid of their old stack and just like moving on to a new platform. So so there's just a ton of different. This is one of the fun parts I feel like about being in this ecosystem, though, is you see all these different kinds of stories, you see all these different kinds of benefits, and then it's sort of like our job as guides to sort of like help people understand, hey, here's the story I think you're in, or here's the benefits that I think you guys can realize or recognize from this.
And I like even
the animal. I like the animal.
I was going to dig into that.
Categorization. Yeah,
because you mentioned, well, we have so I'm going to skip a little bit down in our questions, Fran, because we have something about that later. But since you brought it up, I think maybe we'll talk about the other couple of types too. Or like, so you mentioned the idea of certain companies being eagles, and in your book, you kind of like assign, create these sort of personas. So could you tell us what the other two are, and like give us examples of what those company stories might look like?
Yeah. So there's the eagle, which is sort of the conversion, the e-commerce. Usually it's an e-commerce or very conversion driven site that's sort of scanning the landscape for those opportunities to improve conversion. You kind of have this like caterpillar to butterfly sort of like transformation process, and then you also have we call this like a phoenix, like, which is like, okay, we're just relaunching, out with the old thing, it's going up in smoke. We're setting the old website on fire.
The rise of the phoenix.
Here's the new thing. Here's the new stack. We're going through this big transformation as a company, and we want this new website to almost kind of represent who we are as an organization. And it's just, new and different and changed from the old website. And sometimes that's more of like a transformational campaign. There's large, very well advertised sports companies that have sports focused companies that have built sites on Gatsby. I can't name names, but
NDA.
We get into that too. Like, can we talk about this publicly? No, we can't.
Nope, not yet.
Yeah. So like these types of like great campaign, advertise like sort of like campaign campaigns showing, hey, here's who we are, like let's make a statement, like are often great,
like
sort of
a splashy rebrand, right? Like I'm going to come out, kind of redefine myself and who we are to the market. And so with the butterfly, you mentioned that kind of being like a slow metamorphosis. And is that, I know you talked about like one company who maybe has like 70 sites and they're just like, well, we're just going to kind of chip away at this.
Yeah.
And like slowly move from point A to point B.
So we're working pretty closely with Penn State. They recently launched their news site on Gatsby.
Okay.
Okay.
Which is, it's 70,000 page.
Yeah. And so I came from a university at my previous job. So like I totally understand. Those are massive sites, tons of content editors, super content driven. And like the management process behind all that data is really important because like they've got, like requirements that are legal that they've got to fulfill, for
and the number
ADA and stuff.
Universities are really interesting. We've seen a couple of universities, and one of the things about the universities is it's almost like many organizations under one organization, because you have all these
exactly
departments of the university, and they all have their own similar publishing needs. You've got the campus bookstore and the tutoring center and all these different sort of something that they all need to publish. And so you have so many content publishers that are like creating content, and you need to build a system that sort of enables that, right? It's like a super interesting use case for and to kind of continue on the vein, like, for e-commerce, Jackson, which is a men's jewelry brand, is the one that I was kind of referencing that had that like 2x kind of conversion lift, though we've seen like other folks as well who have like similar kinds of conversion lifts.
Wow,
that's really cool.
That's pretty massive too. It's interesting because I think, and Jeff, I'm gonna like kind of jump around here as far as like our
sure.
This is kind of getting to a question, Sam, that I have with, and this is kind of two-pronged. So because you've been in this for a long time, so it's cool to have you on the show and give us all this data on, hey, this is what I've categorized different types of organizations are at. But here's the thing, from a market standpoint, and really a lot of the dark matter developers that I learned on this show, that Jeff calls them, that don't care, right? They don't care about the Twitterverse. They code, then they got to get their kids to soccer. They just go home after. They don't care what they use. They just want to get the damn job done and what the organization wants. So in your overview of the landscape, Sam, where do you think we are currently in the adoption of modular? And then honestly, and this is selfishly, I hope it becomes the default, but do you think the approach will ever become the default?
Yes. Yeah. The answer to your second question is yes.
Yes. Okay.
I think you're asking exactly the right question, which is, this is why people talk, about crossing the chasm. If you know, I don't know how much you guys use that diagram at WP.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like we have an internal doc about Atlas and like Headless WordPress, and that's all. Like we're talking about where are we at now? What are we doing to
where we at? Yeah,
like move us to the next segment. So for sure,
it's such a great metaphor. It's such a great metaphor. But to share it for I think the viewing audience, there's a model that was popularized about 20-30 years ago. Has become super common called crossing, and it's called the technology adoption model. And the book that popularized it is called Crossing the Chasm. And so it talks about, you've got these different segments of technology users. You've got, and they all have different appetites for risk is a good way of thinking about it. So you've got the very early sort of like innovators, like you see the sort of the diagram is like a bell curve, and different sort of slices of the bell curve. And so you have like on the far left end, you have the kind of the innovators, like, who just are really excited by new things and they just want whatever's new. And then you sort of have the early adopters who like, they're more driven by like, results. They don't really care about social proof per se. They just want results. And so if the new thing delivers like results, then they like it. And then after that, you kind of have the early majority. And so that's kind of the chasm is often between the early adopters and the early majority, which is, the next. So the early adopters are about 12.5% of, and the early majority is the next, I guess, like 30-35. And so they want to make sure, and so they've got questions like, hey, like, has this been used in my industry before? Like, has this been used by companies like me? What does your implementation, support look like? Because they want to be successful, but they know that they may not sort of like, they know that they may not, they're going to need some help kind of getting there and building the organizational buy-in. And they don't want it to like break sometimes, and so I think like we're sort of getting to that place where we're starting to kind of cross the chasm, and we've got a lot of early adopter users, and we've got some early majority users, and so early adopter users are generally like, we just did a webinar with like Service Titan, which is like a Series E or whatever $7 billion company. They're a technology company, and they've used Gatsby to power SEO campaign for that like really boosted their conversion rates and increased their demos, and but then they're a big technology company, so they're like more on the early adopter side because they really care about results. But but they're a technology company, and then we see we see folks that are not technology companies like universities.
And I would say, just knowing what I know about universities, Penn State having done this suggests that sort of early majority thing, right? Because they're very risk averse environments. They're not going to do something unproven, but Penn State and like a couple of these ones are more innovative than the rest of them. They were one of the first people to jump on online education in a big way. And so like they're moving ahead of the pack, and sort of what they do then trickles down to all the other people who can then say, oh, well, Penn State did it. Like, so maybe we can do some version of that next. So like, that's spot on. And to have like that type of risk avert, like, and that's what they would need to see, right? They would need to see proof, and they're probably a little bit more results oriented, because that's how the people who are focused on online ed tend to be, is, they care a little bit more about conversion rates and stuff like that. So like, performance benefits alone might have convinced them that it was a solid move. But
I just had a thought too. It's interesting as Sam was talking, as far as like the reasoning on will this ever become default? And I believe like we're already doing what it does take to get there. That's my opinion. It's just a matter of time, because at the end of the day, here's what's happening to all these services, these technology companies that provide web. You're essentially, there's the Shopify's, they're APIs now, and everything's API driven.
Yep.
So by default, these are modular and decoupled. Essentially what Billman was preaching to me when I was at Netlify. He's like, Fran, if you look at any third-party backend service now, they just ship with an API now, usually with a GraphQL layer, and then there's a GraphQL IDE, and you're just used to it. And then and then you can pull that data out.
Shopify is doing with hydrogen, it's the same kind of it's the same kind of movement. And so here's what I'll say though, and I think this is the second part of the story, which is, what does it take to get from here to there? And there's two answers to that. One is that it's just this domino industry by industry domino effect. So, and use case done. So for example, we started 5-6 years ago, this was just blogs and portfolio sites of developers, then it became small startup websites, you and a few buddies, 5-person startup. And then it became like Series A, Series B startups, larger startups. You start getting these really small sort of like personal shopping sites, and larger e-commerce sites. Oh, I'm a D2C company doing $1 million of revenue. Now we see some of the, we see Little Caesars who's, selling, millions of pieces. On Gatsby and on this new modular stack, and then in like large European pharmaceutical companies, Roche, and but it just goes from like these smaller, it's like domino one by one, and you nerd out and show the like there's, I think I have a diagram here in chapter
let's see this.
This is like in the beginning of chapter 11, but it's like 15 different industries kind of on that curve.
Oh, cool.
And it's just like you sort of like industry by industry, the some are more risk averse, some are more
Mhm.
risk tolerant, and but each industry has a tipping point, and over time the web sort of just tips in industry by industry, use case by kind of use case. That said, what I will say is that the thing that needs to happen now to enable that, and this is actually probably a good transition into some of the conversation we were having before we started hitting record, is that the integration story needs to be more solid. The biggest problem that larger companies face, that we just hear all the time from our larger customers, and just from folks who are very much sitting on the sideline, or they're it's like they've got 100 chip stack and they're putting one or two in, and they're keeping the rest in reserve, and they're not putting it in because they want to watch all these tools integrate better together.
Yes.
And sorry, I'm realizing my door's open and you're hearing some leak.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I can riff off that for a second, because that it's absolutely huge. And that was a lot of what my old job was integrating all these different systems and making them talk to each other in ways that should have been almost native,
Native.
And
yes.
so
Jeff, yeah.
Providing that solution. And you see a bunch of startups in this space too. There's Retool and a couple of lower code developer productivity platforms that I think are really focused on okay, well, you need a quick business app that integrates Gmail and this thing, and here's how you make that, and don't spend a bunch of engineering time doing it. And it's really neat to see that happen in I guess the GraphQL space. And that's the conversation we were having before the podcast started, was the Stellate's doing something where they're creating some data graph, what would we say? Graph OS, Apollo GraphQL, maybe. Fran, a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was just reading about the article that they just released, their GraphQL runtime. And what it allows you to do is not only mesh all your data content with a GraphQL layer at the development process, but modularly, to Sam's, in relation to Sam's book, future-proof as you start adding more data schemas to your GraphQL layer. I haven't played with it yet. I just opened a new account. I'm going to start. It allows you to iterate on it, future stack, and it just builds and builds and builds on top of your data, and you're pulling in all this content and this data, and it's supposed to make it real seamless. And it's a GraphQL runtime, and then the Stellate stuff just caches that stuff at the edge and invalidates it and makes it faster.
So that was a CDN, but I felt like they were working on a second piece of that. Yeah, that was a little bit more integration focused. But
there's something I'll have to give you access to in about, let's say a few weeks.
Awesome.
for this conversation, which is so we have this project called, because it's so funny and so cool that you guys were basically having this conversation beforehand. We have this project that we've been working on for a while called Valhalla, and what that basically is Gatsby's data layer that has all the different content sources getting pulled into it, and being able to use that. So right now you can pull that into Gatsby, into your Gatsby site. But what if any, and because we create a GraphQL API, right? You can access it in Graphql when you're building your Gatsby site, and see the schema that all of your data has transformed into, whether you're pulling from Contentful or Shopify or an Airtable or a Google Sheet, or it's all coming into our data layer. And then we're thinking about, hey, how do you use that at runtime, and maybe in non-Gat, and as well as thinking about using it in non-Gatsby applications as well. So you guys, I think it's this space is, you guys have caught. There's so much exciting going on in the space, and everybody's realizing that this content orchestration and integration piece is the next problem that we need to solve for users who are using these sites, because it's being able to pull a bunch of these different data sources together and use them sort of collectively, and not have to write a bunch of this glue code and to pass things between.
Wow,
that's the thing. So, honestly,
go ahead, Fran,
because he hit the nail on the head. It's what he called glue code. I call developer toil, because there's configurations you have to write as a dev to make these SDKs and everything talk together. I have not taught. I have yet in my young developer. I've only been coding for 3 years. Every developer from junior to senior tells me that they hate that piece. It's toil.
They do.
Damn, it's toil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
There's nothing creative about it. It's just like paste this stuff in here and send this data like
and
this.
hope it connects.
Yeah. And like, oh, I need to get this related model, or like, oh, how do I hit this API this way, or like, and then you just realize your code is just gluing things together, and you're like, did I really have to do that? Yeah, I had to do it, but it sucks. And
yeah. Well, and so I just kind of like want to take a step back and like just ask a clarifying question to make sure what you said is kind of like what I heard. So it sounds like this new project that you're working on may enable the Gatsby content mesh to be used by like non-Gatsby apps.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Oh wow, that's really cool.
I want some access to
yeah. Like while I don't have a ton of experience with Gatsby, and when I say a ton, I mean like basically zero. Like I've read the docs and like done a couple of things like that, but the content mesh has always been something that just was so interesting to me and like such a good idea. So like that's super cool. That is super cool.
Man, should we move the developer site to Gatsby instead? I'm just kidding. Jeff, I don't know. we're transitioning the framework to a new anyway. Sam,
yeah, I think we still got to drink our own champagne there.
Champagne, but,
do it.
But you're making me drink your champagne now, Sam.
For sure. That's really cool. I mean, I'm definitely gonna go give it a look. And that was not, and I'll say that was not my choice there was not because of Gatsby. It was more because of React. Like I'm a huge Vue fan. So I was just like, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the React. So
no, for sure. Let me sort of I'll sort of pull this up on the screen too. While I'm sort of like putting from the screen on my book. This is a diagram or architecture diagram that I did in a talk last year. But it's basically like all the different systems that a lot of different systems that people need to use. And so for the listening audience, think about like you've got your framework Gatsby, and so you need to be pulling data in from your headless CMS, right? You need to be a lot of times you might be pulling in from a commerce thing. Sometimes your headless CMS and commerce are sending data to each other so that people with one system can see within their headless CMS can see the looking at that are maybe editing a custom field or a product variant for a specific SKU can see the rest of the SKU information. So there's often some data integration there. You're pulling in sort of like your React components, maybe from like a storybook. And sometimes those CMSs, right, need to reference, or those components are like, maybe it's like a landing page component and it's referencing content inside the CMS. And like, if we think about like a lot of, on the other side, there's like the performance analytics or like you're sending data to a bunch of different analytics systems, and that's great, but sometimes that hurts your performance. And so sometimes you need to implement tools that sort of almost orchestrate that. And then, you've got, again, like Algolia Auth0, like all these different services coming in. And so, when you start showing these types of, it's important to be thinking about this architecture when you're building a new site, but it's also complex. And the more systems you have to integrate together to make a given workflow work, this is like every one that you have to put together increases the likelihood that something goes wrong. And then like someone may be in another system, they may not realize they're like, something's broken, but I don't know why. And so like the better, the better integrations we have between all these systems, I think Valhalla orchestrating the different content pieces, and that's going to be one of them. But one of the other things is like, hey, how do we get landing pages that are like pull from, your React components or your Vue components that pull from your content, that live with the code inside your framework, but then to get deployed to your hosting platform, right? That's 4 systems right there, how do we make that workflow simple too? That's some folks are thinking about that. Hopefully like that gets simpler over the next couple of years, and as we get those, but the thing is, I'm confident, like these things, these technology trends take time. And so like, I feel like as an ecosystem, as like, technologies and vendors working together, we're just kind of like in the process of nailing one after another, and like maybe we get the content orchestration thing solved, like work, get that to a place where people are like pretty happy with it over the next year. And then like, maybe as an ecosystem, we go tackle the landing page side of things the year after that or whatever, and then so on and so forth, right? It's just technology trends take time.
This is going to be wild what the internet's going to look like in 10 years. Like, honestly, it's kind of crazy with the AI and the Dolly stuff and the stuff that we're pulling in as far as this is going to be.
Does a node at the edge automatically use Dolly to make you like a website based on your preferences or something? And just,
whoa, Jeff.
I don't know. Like, I mean, I guess that like maybe they don't have GPUs at the edge yet. But they're coming. They're coming, I'm sure.
Oh man.
It is kind of nuts.
It's it's like Terminator 2, Rise of the Machines. Anyway, I'm just kidding.
Well, and then it gets into all sorts of like ethical implications because like, it's producing all this artwork based on the idea that humans will continue to make artwork. We're like, now maybe everybody just uses AI to make artwork, right? Like, so does it start to feed itself? And then what happens then?
Oh man.
Like, or people stop making real art and it doesn't have any source material? Does it? I don't know. It's like,
it's going to be wild.
It's real wild.
I'm here for it, man.
Yeah. And I don't think about questions like that because then my head just starts to hurt.
Yeah.
Oh no. So this is a question I like to ask everybody because, like, obviously at WP Engine, we're very focused on the headless WordPress piece, making headless WordPress easier to use. So, like, if you could like wave a magic wand, what would you change about WordPress to make it like better serve the needs of developers using Gatsby?
If I could wave a magic wand, I would probably, one thing we hear a lot from folks is that they're like, I'm using Yoast in WordPress, and Yoast is a great tool, and gosh, I can just enter in my, enter in the stuff I want, and then it's WordPress, Yoast and WordPress kind of like magically take care of optimizing the SEO, on a page basis, on a template basis, on sort of like whatever I want. I would sort of press a button, and I would sort of press a magic button and get like the top, 10 or 15 WordPress plugins and make them like work just as well. It's so like in the let me take a step back before I say that. Now when you sort of move into the headless world, you still get your data coming in from Yoast, right? But now you need to figure out, okay, great, how do I feed this into my React components so that it works the same way that it would like work in Yoast? In a monolithic or standard WordPress install. And so if I could just press a button, I would say like, gosh, I want whatever those like top 10, 15 plugins in the WordPress world to just work out of the box the same way in Gatsby or a different, different framework, same way that they work in the WordPress world.
I think that's a great call.
Yeah,
that's a great call. And I think we're
it's like that's the glue code.
Yeah.
Right? Like I don't want to have to re-implement meta tags, like, and especially when you use Yoast, like, because that's just, you're right, it just pops it in there for you and does it. But that's great feedback. And yeah, I mean, we're slowly like getting there, but it's always that question of like, I guess just like time and money, and scope of work. Cause it's like when we talk about those top 15 plugins on WordPress, I mean, what collectively that's like millions of sites and stuff like that. So therein lies the challenge, but we're like plugging away at it. But that's great feedback and something we hear from a lot of people.
Sort of
yeah, and that's why I ask, because like sometimes I ask that question and like this is the first time I've phrased it in that way, and I think that's kind of how I'm going to do it from now on, because it really is just like, even if it's like a pie in the sky thing, I want you to tell me like what's the biggest, most impactful thing we could do. And that is certainly one of them, where it's just like all of these problems are just much easier to solve out of the box.
Honestly, because the thing is,
what we can.
It's funny because speaking of what to do better in WordPress and making it a headless CMS. Thank you, Sam. We took Jason Ball from Gatsby, but I was talking to Jason on a we one-on-one once a week to nerd out and stuff. And he's saying like there's so many extensions, right, to WP GraphQL on itself as a plugin. Yeah. Then there's advanced custom fields, custom content types. To Sam's point, and Jason was like, if there could just be one mega headless WordPress plugin, that ships with WP GraphQL, ACF, and all those things, instead of having to download, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That would definitely sweeten the DevX on headless WordPress for sure. So yeah, I get that, Sam.
But
so
I honestly, like, to just piggyback on it, I think it's great that we can all sort of like work together on this stuff. You know, Jason worked for us for a little while, and like, you know, then he moved over to work for you guys, and like that's great. You know, Sheen worked for us for you guys, and for us for a while. I was working for you guys, which is great. But we're all sort of like working together to build this new world, and you know, we're all figuring out over time like who wants to work on which pieces when, and you know, maybe we work on some pieces for a while, and then like you guys work on some pieces for a while, and you know, it all sort of like works out in the end over time, right? And that's the exciting thing about just being kind of part of this.
You know what's funny is what's funny is just I had so sometimes I have like these we all dream when we sleep. I have these really wild dreams. 2 weeks ago, I actually dreamt, y'all, and this is never going to happen. I dreamt, Sam, this is interesting. You say this like we all work together. I dreamt that the decoupled JAMstack world modular becomes one big company, like one mega huge, like a Google, but instead do you guys feel my flow here?
No,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And maybe Sam and Matt Billman are the CEOs of this thing, and then, you know, I'm working for you. Anyway, it's just kind of like, and we're all coworkers. That'd be crazy. Like, all these people are all in our like family, so to speak. But
it's funny because like in some ways that you know, in some ways, and especially like on Twitter or whatever, that's already sort of the case where it's like we're all at, you know, if there's JAMstack Conf, you know, we're going to be at JAMstack Conf, and you guys are, and we're going to be at JAMstack Conf, and everyone's going to be sort of there together. And like I have this like network diagram on the cover of the book to kind of just illustrate that like everything is kind of connected together. You know, and like, you know, in some ways, like, you know, in some ways there's another joke that I'll share that, you know, which is, it's, you know, I think you'll sort of, I think there's some implications there. Some, I think it's true for the modular web ecosystem as well, which is that, you know, a few years ago, like a taxi driver an Uber driver was in San Francisco, and like they've been driving in Uber in San Francisco for like, you know, 6 months, and then they finally realized, they're like, oh wow, you know, I just realized, like, whenever I ask anybody like, well, where do you work, they're like, oh, I work at a startup. So I just thought there was like one big company in San Francisco called Startup. It's actually wasn't the case.
That's actually
the
pretty
ship
fun.
Decoupled, yeah. That is hilarious.
Oh man,
I thought there was one big company called Startup.
And just a prime example of that, and then it's time for that time of the podcast for Fran's fun question. But Sam, are you familiar? Do you know who Colby Fayok is? He works at Cloud.
Yeah. We've seen
Colby.
Stuff. Yeah. He's done some Gatsby stuff.
Colby's a good friend of mine too, but couple of months ago, he had an issue with his dynamic file for get static pass in Next.js with headless WordPress, and he has a free account on it because he's DevX, and we try. Again, this is your point. We're all kind of coworkers. He DM'd me because we had some support for him, and we like helped him troubleshoot it. Because Jason L was like, "Fran, can you help him out? You work at WP," and we helped him out, and then it became a live stream of him and Jason Ball. And Sam, this is to your point where whether we like it or not in this space, especially with DevRel and DevX and you coming on the webinar with CEOs talk, we are kind of all coworkers, except we just legally work for different entities. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Lots of cross-pollination.
It's cross-pollination for sure. Yeah.
And everybody's so cool and supportive too, which is an awesome thing.
It's so awesome. Yeah.
It's great. I agree 100%.
Okay, everybody, folks, it's time for the last question of the podcast. So, Sam, you obviously can't do web dev and be a nerd 24/7. Although, I mean, you can, because I am. But outside of web development, when you need to decompress and do something else, rock climbing, surfing, competitive eating, cooking, I don't know what you do. What do you do outside? What do you do for fun, man?
Well, I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I spend.
Oh, yeah.
Love them. We go. They love swimming, so we go swimming. We go.
Nice.
We go to the park. We go hiking.
Outdoor stuff, right?
Pretty much whatever they're. We go chase garbage trucks. Whatever their 5 or 3-year-old selves are excited about, like that is the thing we do.
You live in? You said you're in Sacramento, right?
I'm over
Sam?
in Sacramento.
I'm definitely an avid rock climber. How far is Sacramento to Yosemite National Park?
It's about 2.5 hours, so it's.
Oh, you can go there for the day then, and then go back home if you wanted. Okay, cool, very cool.
Much. It's a nice, it's pretty close. And Yosemite's obviously beautiful. It's like great out there.
Yeah, I've camped out there and stuff like that, but I have yet to. Jeff, have you been to Yosemite?
So I've never been to California.
Oh, okay. There's a monolith called El Capitan.
West. Okay, yeah, I've seen that. I've watched like the Alex Honnold,
the free solo.
Yeah.
I don't know if that encourages people to do rock climbing.
Yeah, no, that was like, oh, this isn't for me. Back away. But I'd love to see California. That's on my bucket list of things to do.
No.
I've seen Nevada.
Go to Yosemite, hit me up. We'll
okay.
Ooh.
And we'll watch Fran rock climb.
Hey,
I'll be your moral support, Fran. Go, Fran, go.
And Jeff, in order to make it work related so we can expense it, we'll tell WP Engine we're doing a conference with Sam at Yosemite. You heard it live here, folks. Gatsby conference is going to be at Yosemite National Park next year.
Let's do it.
Anyway. That's awesome. Yeah, Sam. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks,
and I know you've mentioned your book a couple times. So is there anything you want to plug about that? Yeah. And we can definitely leave some links down in the show notes.
Yeah, for sure. So Modular, the web's new architecture and how it's changing online business. It's available on Amazon. You can sort of Google the title and get there. If you want to understand the backstory of how all these technologies came to exist, if you want to get a sense of like what a successful implementation looks like in your company, or how to think about the architecture and the different types of technology together, if you're trying to work with non-technical stakeholders and give them some of the background and context so you can get the buy-in from others in the organization, highly recommend grabbing a copy. Modular, the web's new architecture.
Awesome.
Thanks, Sam. I actually am going to grab one and buy it because it'll also help me with my own blog post writing, because I'm writing every day about the JAMstack. So I bet there's tidbits there I can actually get.
And absolutely. And some of the ways you've conceptualized those transformation stories and stuff like that sounds really useful, because it's such a complex, like it's not complex, but it is complex. And talking about it is complex. So talk about that. Yeah. And then maybe we'll get some autographed copies when we go.
Yes.
Go to Yosemite. So
let's do it. I'll send you a couple.
Awesome.
Well, I was thinking I'll bring my book and you can sign it.
You can sign it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Sam, so much for agreeing to come on. Definitely appreciate our conversation and your time. And thanks for listening.
All right.
Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun to be here. And I'll talk to you guys and talk to you. I'm sure I hope to meet everybody who's listening in the audience at some point. Please email me if you have questions about Gatsby or about the book or about implementing it. I email sam@gatsbyjs.com, and it's a pleasure chatting with you guys and talking to everybody listening.
All right. Very cool, y'all. Have a good one.
Cheers, y'all. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in to the Headless WP podcast. If you liked today's episode, go ahead and give us a share or a like on whatever platform you're listening on. And be sure to keep in touch with the WP Engine Developer Relations team on Twitter, Discord, or through our website. Thanks for listening.